And our meteorologists have been talking about the potential for river levels to break records at some gauges over the next few days. But some of you have been asking, what about that great flood of 1986? Meteorologist Amber Tuardi is back to talk more about that historic event and how this flooding compares. So Amber, how does it?
Yeah, we've been getting a lot of comments kind of asking about, hey, what about the flood of 1986? A lot of people have that strong in their memories, and there's a good reason for it. There was a lot of rain that came down in a very short period of time, resulting in so much flooding that 14 small dams actually had failures. And then also there were definitely a lot of areas that were inundated because of that flood. And there were even some fatalities out of this deadly storm. So here's a look at some of the video that was taken back in 1986. Yeah, definitely a lot of floodwaters. You can see some of those sandbags piled up. This is a video along the Muskegon River at the Hardy Dam. Look at how that's just overflowing the dam entirely. Now, thankfully, Hardy Dam, Croton Dam, neither of those had failures, but the Hart Dam over in Petwater did have a failure, and so did the Comstock, or rather the Cortland Dam that was in Rockford and was not rebuilt. So here's a couple of more videos of what we saw out of that storm. This was significant and of course very rich in people's memories that did have to experience it, especially north of I-96. That's where things were the absolute worst. So if we can turn things over and look at some of those totals that we experienced from this. This was provided by the National Weather Service in Detroit. It did look like there were multiple areas at least that saw several inches of rainfall over a 3-day span. Big Rapids, over a foot of rain in just 3 days. So we've been talking about several inches over the past couple of days here and more recently, but it's still only been about 4 or 5 inches or so, a little bit more than that in some spots, but talking about over a foot of rainfall in just 3 days is very significant. About a 60-mile stretch from west to east of just how much we saw that really significant flood back in 1986. This happened in September, so unfortunately, that really had a strong impact on crops. A little bit further south, things weren't as bad. Over that 3-day span, saw less than an inch closer to the Kalamazoo area, and over just east, or rather just north of Ann Arbor, just north and west of Ann Arbor, really. But the areas that saw the most of that rainfall and unfortunately the worst flooding also had to experience some pretty significant impacts. 30 counties were affected by this historic flood. There was $500 million estimated in damages, mainly to crops. And I did a little bit of math, and it looks like that's close to and even slightly over $1.5 billion in today's dollars. Now, on top of that, there were also 10 deaths statewide, and hundreds were injured because of this storm. So I want to give you a look at what we're seeing at the Croton Dam now versus what we saw back in 1986. The record was set at 16.8 feet. Once again, back in 1986, we're expected to get closer to 12.8 feet as we're heading into early tomorrow morning. So that's quite a bit a ways off from the Croton Dam. But the reason I want to show you that first is because that is one area where that record does reflect data back into the 80s. Not all river gauges do show that, though. So here's a look at what we're seeing from the Muskegon River at Newaygo. Now, the record was set at 15.1 feet. But we are now already past that. Now, the reason that that record is so low is not because they did not see significant flooding from that 80s flood, but instead because that gauge simply wasn't there at the time, so it was not able to collect that data. So technically, we are going to be breaking some records for Newaygo, Bridgeton along the Muskegon River. That's also the case here for what we're seeing for Bridgeton. That previous record set at 16.8 feet, we're already past that and expected to hit 20 feet heading into this weekend. Now, I want to give you a look at what we're seeing across West Michigan, the Lower Peninsula in general, and why we are seeing so many more data points along our rivers across the region now versus what we saw multiple years ago. So back in 1987, it was reported that there were only 136 gauges statewide. Now we have 206. So plenty more gauges, plenty more data plots to be able to actually show how high the rivers were, just how strong that flooding was and how impactful it was. The impacts alone really just tell us how strong it was, including a lot of the pictures and videos that we've seen from it. But there is the reason why still we're talking about some gauges setting new records, because they simply don't have data that goes all the way back into the 80s. Now, still, we are going to be experiencing multiple spots that have flood alerts out for them. So the White River, Downstream from the Hesperia Dam, currently still seeing not just a river flood warning, but also a flash flood watch for the entire county of Oceana County. So the reason for that is because of the potential for dam failure here. Now that has not happened yet, but of course we'll be keeping a close eye on that for you. That's not the only area where we are seeing these flood alerts, though. All of West Michigan under a flood watch until early tomorrow morning. Flood warnings through northern Michigan. That's another spot that you've likely been hearing a lot about and seeing some pictures from. Plenty of flooding in downtown Traverse City, and also, of course, talking about that potential for dam failure and even an evacuation notice up towards Sheboygan.